Hello, welcome to Understanding Our Successes and Errors Through Multiple Control and Complex Verbal Behavior. I'm Tom Ratkos, and I want to thank you for coming to my talk today. I know there are a lot of great talks at this conference, so thank you for spending some time with me. I want to start with some acknowledgments. I want to thank the National Autism Conference organizers for inviting me to give this talk. I'm very honored. There have been some amazing behavior analysts that have talked at this conference in the past and presently, so I feel very honored to be among them. I want to thank Dave Palmer for being extremely supportive to me in all these lines of thought that I'm going to be talking about today, and in recommending me for to give this talk to you all. I'd like to thank Jim Todd at Eastern Michigan University for planting the Skinnerian seed into a directionless undergraduate, and my graduate advisor Jessica Frieder for giving me a whole career and really a whole life to be leading. So thank you to those people. And let's get started. Today we're going to talk about multiple control and how it does not just apply to verbal behavior. Oftentimes when we talk about multiple control, we get caught in a trap of just referring to multiple control as though it only refers to verbal behavior. So we're going to talk about multiple control. We're going to talk about covert verbal behavior or private events, what we cannot observe or what's not observable from an outside person, the what and the how of covert verbal behavior, how to study it. We're going to talk about joint control a little bit, what it is, and perhaps why is it in our field. We're going to talk about autoclitics, an underrepresented topic, I think, in verbal behavior, the topography or function, and some past and present work, some work that I've done with autoclitics. And we're going to talk about behavior analysis and the unconscious, and talk about some fun projective tests. And then we're also going to talk about some hokum, or some things that we might quickly dismiss as good skeptics and as good behaviorists. But I will argue that there is some hokum out there, specifically the behavior of psychics, that can tell us a lot about complex verbal behavior that I hope you'll find interesting. All right, let's get started. Let's review the verbal operants. This is an advanced talk, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but just so that we're all on the same page and we can kind of ramp up to a pace that hopefully everyone can keep up with. Obviously, all the verbal operants come from Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior from 1957, but previously in 1930 he had the William James lectures and the Hefferline notes at Harvard. So Skinner had been working on this for a long time, and in Skinner's own words, paraphrase here, verbal behavior was to him his most important work, and I would certainly agree with that. And I would encourage everyone to pick up your copy of Verbal Behavior. You have a copy of Verbal Behavior, right? And read it. And it does go beyond chapter 9. A lot of times people, when they're reading verbal behavior, they stop at the operants. But I'm going to encourage us all to read the entire book. It is still underread, even though it's beginning to be appreciated more and more. So let's talk about those operants. We're going to talk about the controlling variable, the stimulus, or the type of stimuli that has evocative control over the operant, and then what the operant is. And first, we'll start with the tact. The tact is controlled by some nonverbal stimulus in the environment. And now I know what you're thinking. Where is the reinforcer? Well, when we're talking about stimulus control, we know that the reinforcement contingency is what gives a stimulus control. But we're going to talk about the controlling variable, the antecedent variable, because as we know in verbal behavior especially, except for the mand, we often say that the reinforcer for a verbal operant is generalized social reinforcement, which I think hides a ton of complexity that we do not have the time to get into right now. But let's focus on the types of stimuli that have gained control or evocative control over these responses. So for the tact, we're talking about nonverbal stimuli in the environment. For an intraverbal, we're talking about a verbal stimulus that does not have any similarity to the response, either the speaker's own previous emitted response, or another speaker's response that you react to as a listener, and then respond in some way as a speaker with an interverbal. The echoic is another verbal operant where, we can also combine with our analysis of the echoic the duplic, as some people call it, and copying a text. Those all have the same functional similarity of being controlled by a verbal stimulus with formal similarity. We often talk about it like it's the same stimulus. There's no stimulus is the same as another, but functionally they are the same. And that formal similarity refers to the modality of the response. So finger spelling with finger spelling, writing with writing, certainly copying a text, or when you hear something and then you say something that produces the functionally identical response. So that's the echoic. You can have textual responses, and with textual responses, functionally identical is the codic relation and also taking dictation. The controlling variable there that has evocative power is a verbal stimulus that has point-to-point similarity. So there are smaller bits of the controlling stimulus that control small bits of the response. And if we saw changes in the small bits of the evocative stimulus, we would see corresponding changes to the response. The mand, oftentimes we talk about as the first operant we learn when crying differentiates to different motivating operations, is controlled by deprivation or aversive stimulation, and is the only verbal operant that has a characteristic reinforcer that satisfies that motivating operation. And unless you thought we were done, no, we are not. We're also going to talk about the autoclitic. The autoclitic is arguably the most complicated of Skinner's verbal operants, and it's the one that he spends relatively less time and space on in the book Verbal Behavior. The autoclitic has a lot of different types, but generally speaking, the autoclitic is controlled by the speaker's own verbal behavior and an MO for a specific effect on the listener. And that can get pretty complicated. But we're going to talk about one specific type today, a little later on today, the descriptive autoclitic, where the controlling variable, in addition to the primary verbal response, is the source of control of that primary response. And that is what is used to modify the primary response and changes the effect on the listener. So we'll come back to that in a little bit, and I'll remind you about the descriptive autoclitic when it's relevant. Okay, so with all these different categories, all these verbal operants, what we're doing is not unlike the task of all natural sciences. We're trying to take nature and we're trying to put it in a bunch of different boxes that we made. That's kind of what making technical terminology and a lot of other rhetorical devices in science is. It's kind of trying to make sense of and separate out what is a continuous process and complex process of nature. We're trying to put it in little boxes that we've created and defined so that we can better understand it. So this is a metaphor here displayed visually, but as we can see, like, the boxes that we've made, they mostly fit, but sometimes they're spilling out of the edges. So some boxes, maybe this should be 2 boxes, or maybe the box should just be much bigger. But in behavior analysis, when we come to questions like this, we have a pragmatic truth criterion, which means that what is true or what is right in our science is what leads to useful action. What is useful to us in the description, prediction, and control of the natural world. So I think we do a pretty good job of that, and I think Skinner's categories of verbal operants are a good way to separate nature, but we shouldn't get caught in a trap where we think that the verbal operants exist in nature. Remember, we're taking a very complex system, and we are categorized. It's an activity of humans. So this is an imperfect way to do it, and we know that as behavior analysts. And I want to illustrate that with a quote from Jack Michael, Dave Palmer, and Mark Sundberg in their 2011 paper, The Multiple Control of Verbal Behavior. They say, the pure forms of the respective verbal operants are rare outside of the laboratory or instructional contexts. A common preoccupation of students is to try to classify utterances as one or another verbal operant on the assumption that the example must be exclusively one type, and that's my emphasis added. The point that they're trying to illustrate is that any verbal utterance is necessarily multiply controlled. And even when we try to construct in a laboratory or instructional context very pure operants, we never really get there. You cannot separate out different instances of stimulus control even in those instructional contexts. So we want to know the small bits that combine together to make the complexity of our world. But those small bits don't exist without each other. So multiple control is the default, but knowing the little pieces that go into it is extremely helpful for understanding it. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is multiple control. Multiple control, the authors of that paper described two types of multiple control. They talked about convergent multiple control, where lots of different stimuli all are exerting this evocative control over one specific response or one topography of response. So lots of different things controlling one response in an additive way. And there's also divergent multiple control, where one stimulus has evocative power over not just one response, but lots of different responses. So that's convergent, lots of different stimuli, one response, and divergent, one stimulus leading to many different responses. So let's go over an example of each of those. Let's take a look at this dog. Now, I may have advanced the slide, and you might have said, "Aw," and that is one response that's perhaps evoked by this picture. But there are lots of different responses evoked by this picture. Just the image of the dog could be tacted as dog, Shih Tzu, bow, fur, eyes, nose, grass, photograph. Maybe if you had a specific learning history, you could tact it as narrow range of field. That's a photography term. That's why the dog's face is sharp and the grass is blurry. But there's lots of different responses evoked. If it was a real dog, there'd be even more responses evoked. You might look to a nearby person and say, "What's her name?" Which would enable you to perhaps call the dog over. You might look to a nearby person and say, "Can I pet your dog?" You might look at the dog and say, "Here, girl," and that would that in the past that's been followed by animals approaching, and then you get to pet them. So lots of different responses. Even in a still image, lots of different responses are evoked. So that's divergent multiple control. We see one stimulus evoking or possibly evoking, and we'll talk about the things that determine which response is evoked. One stimulus evoking lots of different possible responses. For convergent multiple control, we're going to start with a specific response, a speaker saying pencil. And this example is outlined in that article, Multiple Control of Verbal Behavior, where you can also look at Skinner's text in Chapter 10 and supplementary stimulation for this example. But let's diagram it out. Just for the response pencil, one thing that could evoke this response is an MO. You could manipulate an MO. You could offer a large reward for a drawing. If you walked into a room with lots of people and said, $500 to the first person who draws me a picture of a kitty cat, that might evoke pencil as a mand in some of those listeners. It's a conditioned, transitive, motivating operation. Your offer of a reward for a drawing makes a pencil suddenly a much stronger reinforcer and evokes behavior that's been reinforced with a pencil in the past. So that's one manipulation that could evoke this response. You could also have the auditory verbal discriminative stimulus of pencil. So if I said pencil, you might be more likely to say pencil right back to me as an echoic. And we could have both of these things happen at the same time, right? And they could add together to evoke pencil. We could also have a textual SD of pencil and evoke the vocal response pencil as a textual response. So if we had, neon flashing lights, pencil, someone might look at it and say pencil. Same topography. You could have the intraverbal auditory verbal SD of paper and you might do that inflection that makes people respond, paper, and you might find yourself saying pencil. You could have a very conspicuous, unusual pencil that would evoke that response as a tact. Imagine you're giving a friend a tour of your town, and you round the corner, and in the public square, there's a large sculpture of a pencil with arms and legs. That's a conspicuous, unusual pencil. And you might find your guest saying, "Oh, what's the deal with that pencil?" You might evoke that response very, very quickly as a tact. Underlying all this is the audience control. So another person speaking English might be necessary, although oftentimes we assume that our audience is a good verbal partner in our verbal community. But we cannot forget that the audience relation is involved in almost all of our verbal behavior. So if all of these things were all taking place at the same time, we would get a very short latency, high probability, high magnitude response of pencil, right? We could get someone jumping up and down and screaming pencil. And this is an example of convergent multiple control. Lots of different stimuli and environmental variables, all evoking one response. Here, pencil. Now, I want to talk about a slightly different topic, but very much related: conditional stimulus control selecting from divergent multiple control. So we're going to look at another image here, and this is the image that I'm supplying, and we're going to talk about how we can select from among possible responses. This picture could evoke lots of responses as a tact, and then you could cascade from that tact into several intraverbals, perhaps. You could look at this and respond. These are lots of possible tacts. You could say balls, you could say marbles, you could say blue, you could say abstract, you could say crowd. You're starting to tact conceptual ideas about the picture. You're starting to attack kind of metaphorical, like what could this picture mean if it has some meaning, deeper meaning. So all those things could be evoked by this image, and this is an example of divergent multiple control. But what if a second and a half after I showed you this image, I said, "What color?" Well, that would make you very quickly and easily respond with the color tact, blue, right? Very, very easy. I'd show you that image. It has lots of blue marbles on it, some white space. And then I say, "What color?" Most English speakers would have no problem saying blue to that, right? Well, this is two different stimuli, the image and my question of what color. And these don't both control just one response. They both control many responses. The image, as I've laid out here, controls lots of different responses. And if you just heard the phrase "what color" by itself, in the absence of an obvious sample picture, that would evoke lots of intraverbals, namely color words. So blue is evoked by "what color" as an intraverbal, but so is red, so is purple, so is violet, so is green, yellow. All those things are, and more. I was recently choosing house paint, so I have a lot of different, very strange intraverbals for color at the moment. But the only topographical response, the only response that is controlled by both that image and the question "what color" is the answer blue, right? So we see divergent multiple control interacting with a conditional discrimination, and that conditional discrimination selecting from among many possible options. And this very simple task of looking at a picture and saying "what color" has all this stuff going on under the hood that we could think about. Why would we think about it? What would lead us to think about something like this? Well, for me, I could tell you a short story about how I began thinking about these kinds of issues, and it started many years ago in the wonderful city of Kalamazoo, where I was starting my graduate training at Western Michigan University, and my wife and I were at a very busy breakfast restaurant, and we were sitting having breakfast, and it was a rush. And as a former waiter myself, I found myself looking at the waiter and just imagining how different our experiences were at that moment. That I'm relaxing, having a nice omelet, and he's just in the thick of it. So this particular waiter was holding carafes of coffee, probably the calf and the decaf, and he's giving refills to everyone in the restaurant. At breakfast, many people are drinking coffee, and so that is one task that a conscientious wait person does, is refill not just their table but everyone's, right? So he's walking around, dodging around tables, and he's asking people, "Oh, do you want some more coffee? Do you want some more coffee? Do you want a refill?" And as I'm watching him, he goes to refill a coffee, and he spills some coffee. He misses the cup, goes on the table a little bit. He goes, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry." Gets a rag, dries it up, says, "Oh, sorry." There's like, no problem. And then he goes about his job, right? No big deal. He didn't burn anybody or anything. He goes to the next table, and he says, "Splash of coffee," which to me was a lightning rod. I had probably very recently read that 2011 paper on multiple control, because I saw that as an instance of multiple control, and specifically of what I'm calling this conditional discrimination, selecting from divergent multiple control. But we have both convergent and divergent multiple control in this example. So let's talk about what the waiter is doing and what's controlling his responding. The waiter has a lot of different things controlling his responses right now. He has the relatively simple SDs of the full carafes of coffee and empty cups. A full cup doesn't evoke this interaction, and if his carafe was empty, it wouldn't evoke that interaction, because doing this, it doesn't result in the reinforcer of a filled glass. So the full carafe and the empty cup are necessary. The MO to complete your job, he has other things to do. That's taking place right now. That's rather complicated. That's combining lots of different things. There's also the more simple MO of the smile and the thanks that will result in his task from the patrons. And oftentimes you know a lot about your waiter depending on which of those is operating more heavily. If they're motivated for the smile and the thanks, or if they're motivated just to do the next thing. The task looks very different. But it's probably operating at some level. We all like to see a happy face rather than an angry face, so that's probably in there too. Those are reinforcers. You want to start your next task, and the sooner you get this done, the quicker you can go to the next thing you have to do. And there are English-speaking people in the restaurant. If a table was not speaking, or if they were speaking another language, the waiter might do the same task, but non-vocally, right? He might just point at the cup and the carafe. But these things are operating, and what do these things control? Well, they don't control a specific topography. They control an operant, and this operant is some verbal statement indicating that refills are available and manding for information from the customer about the customer's MO. Right? That's what that interaction really is. This is the Skinnerian translation of that interaction. Refills are available. Is coffee a reinforcer for you? That's what I need to get out of the patrons. Lots of different things, lots of different topographies are in that operant. You could say lots of different things. You could say refill, you could say warm up, you could say top off, you could say splash of coffee. You could even say, do you want some more hot bean juice? You could just say refill for every interaction, right? But we all have a shared punishment history of being annoying. And so we're less likely to just repeat ourselves over and over. If there's lots of different responses available, we'll tend to vary them. So, and this waiter was varying them. He was saying different things: warm up, top off, refill, more coffee, etc., etc. Now, what was interesting to me was that after he'd spilled some coffee, at the next table he said splash of coffee, which is one of these possible responses. What I am assuming happened is that there was another source of stimulus control, the spilled coffee, which evokes in itself lots of verbal and nonverbal behavior, the spilled coffee. One verbal response to spilled coffee is splash of coffee. So you can tact the spilled coffee as a splash of coffee, and you can satisfy this MO this man for information with the same topography, a splash of coffee. You put a little inflection on it, a little question mark, and all of a sudden it satisfies both of these things. So I believe my interpretation of this event is that the tact of the spilled coffee selected from among these possible options that all satisfy this MO, but only one of them is also evoked by the precurrent or very quickly antecedent nonverbal stimulus of the splashed coffee, of the spilled coffee. So I thought that was very interesting. We could say that the spilled coffee added strength to one response over another. So what is response strength? This is a photograph of me flexing earlier today, and response strength is often talked about. When we talk about strength, we're talking about magnitude. But that's not necessarily all that's encompassed in this idea of response strength. Skinner and Dave Palmer and probably lots of others have talked about probability or frequency of responding as also a measure of the strength of a response. Even something like the shortened latency of a response could be indicative of this idea of response strength. Unemitted responses, if we want to analyze responses that we can't necessarily always see, or we want to do some predicting of behavior, we want to talk about responses that haven't been emitted yet. So, if we want to analyze things that haven't occurred, or maybe have occurred at a level that we can't observe, we want to talk about the strength of unemitted or unobserved responses. And this principle, I don't want to say principle, this idea of response strength can help us to interpret behavior, which is, of course, what we want to do. So I want to illustrate that. I want to talk about a couple different things that Dave Palmer laid out in his 2009 paper, The Concept of the Repertoire and Response Strength, from the European Journal of Behavior Analysis. There was a couple of schematics, diagrams, that's the word, in that paper that I think were pretty good. So this first one is a spectrum of response strength you see on the far side of this image, from very low response strength to high response strength. And at the lowest end of response strength is the repertoire, right? And the repertoire is not something inside of you. It's just all the responses that, given some environment, you would emit. So just because you would emit jumping jacks under some condition doesn't mean you're doing it now. And in fact, it's extremely unlikely that you would do jumping jacks right now. So that is very low response strength. But it is something you could do, presumably. I'm making assumptions about my audience. Not everyone can do jumping jacks. But for some of us, we could, under some conditions, do jumping jacks. So there is latent behavior that's not occurring, but is occurring at, or it could occur, it's at some strength. And then this first line here is the threshold of emission. Something could have some strength and not be emitted. Like 1 minute ago, you had relatively no chance of doing jumping jacks. But since I've been talking about it, you're a little bit more likely to do it. And so am I. Oh, should I do it? No, I'm not going to do it. But we haven't emitted it yet. If there's some stimulus condition where you are engaging it, what if you start imagining yourself doing jumping jacks? Or what if you're repeating jumping jacks, but you're not doing it in an observable way? You could be emitting behavior covertly. That's a private event. We often talk about just private verbal events, like saying to yourself jumping jacks, but we shouldn't restrict our analysis of private events just to verbal behavior, as we'll talk about a little bit later. So you could emit a response covertly, and that we can think about as having a higher response strength. But it's still not observed. Even stronger a response is emitted overtly in a way that could be observed by someone else. So we get these thresholds of emission and observability along the continuum of response strength. Let's look at one more diagram of this. This is a boiling, like a jug full of liquid that's being brought to boil. Okay. Now, don't think that you have this in some mind. You don't have a mind, and of course you don't have a boiling jug. This is just a tool for interpretation. Okay. So all these little, if you've seen something boil, you know that the first thing that happens is lots of little bubbles appear, but they're stuck to the bottom of the pan or the jug or whatever you're boiling, right? So that's what these are right here. They're little bubbles, but they don't have the energy in physics to leave the bottom of the container and to be emitted as water vapor, right? So some of these bubbles in the process of boiling, we haven't boiled yet, or these things would all be going up. Some of these are going up, but then they're meeting cooler water, and some of them are falling down, and you get this kind of interplay when some bubbles have enough energy, but then maybe they lose energy as they get to cooler parts. So, and then some come out. And in this diagram, we have a response competition, because as living organisms, we often can't engage in very many behaviors simultaneously. Certainly that's the case with vocal behavior. We only have one: diaphragm, esophagus, larynx, tongue, lips, right? I think I got all the parts of vocal speech, but I'm not an SLP. They're the experts. So sometimes you do a thing where you blend them. You try to say cute and funny at the same time. So you say foot, and that's funny, but most of the time you only emit one response at a time, and then the response is emitted. So we see response probability going up and down. And let's look at a concrete example of this abstraction in the instance of semantic priming. Now, if you're not familiar with semantic priming, semantic priming is one thing that psychologists talk about, and some linguists talk about. Semantic priming is when one word will make you say or recognize another word more quickly than others, and they have non-behavioral kind of explanations for how these things occur. And sometimes people are quick to, or behavior analysts are quick to just discount cognitive or other schools of psychology in their experiments, which I think is not surprising, but I think we could miss out on a lot of good data and things that we could interpret with our worldview, and that's one thing that I'll try to do here. So semantic priming, let's look at one example of a semantic priming experiment where you're sitting in a computer screen and you're going to be shown a word, and then you're going to not be shown anything, and then it's time for you to do your task. You're going to be shown another word, and you have to quickly identify if it's an actual word or if it's just letters out of sequence, just nonsense letters. So what you find in that setup is that if I showed you the word bread, and then the screen went black and it was time for you to do a trial, and then the word seagull showed up, you would press the button indicating that it was a word, and you would have some latency to that response. And it would be relatively higher latency than if I showed you bread and then a black screen, and then I showed you the word butter. You would hit the button much more quickly in that trial than in the seagull trial. So relatively high latency to recognize that seagull was a word, and relatively low latency for the word butter to be recognized as a word. Well, how do we as behavior analysts explain that? Well, using this same diagram, when you see the word bread, or when you hear the word bread, however the experiment is done, you are emitting behavior, or not emitting behavior, but some behavior is being potentiated and potentially approaching emission. Some responses are strengthened by that stimulus bread, and these are intraverbal responses, right? We have lots of intraverbals that are controlled by the verbal SD bread. Wheat, pita, and certainly butter. Butter might be the strongest intraverbal, depending on your learning history, of course, when you hear the word bread. Seagull is very weakly, if at all, controlled by bread. So, when you then see the second stimulus of the word butter, you're already almost saying butter, because you've just heard bread. So when you see seagull, it's like, well, that's one source of strength, and I can read seagull's textual response and then respond in a complex listener response as like, yes, this is a word. But butter, I'm already halfway there or more, and that's what that shorter latency is, because you are already almost saying butter. So that's semantic priming through a verbal behavior analysis of multiple control and response strength. And I think it's as an interpretation, it doesn't require us to make any new assumptions of our principles. So what about nonverbal behavior and multiple control? Well, multiple control is not restricted to verbal behavior. And in fact, we know this, all of us know this as behavior analysts, because everything we've learned about generalization techniques implicitly rely on multiple control as being an important factor to any response. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's take a wider view of operant conditioning in general. I want to give a plug for this book, Donahoe and Palmer. I had it up on the screen here, but then I realized this is a digital conference. I'm in my office. I can just show you the book, so it's right there. This is a challenging text, but man, it is a very good one. So if you don't have it, please pick it up. This is going to make you a smarter and more savvy behavior analyst. And we're going to talk about one thing in this book, and that's unifying respondent and operant processes into a unified reinforcement principle. Does that sound scary? It's not. It's not that scary. I'm gonna lay it out for you here visually. So the one thing that we have to start with if we're gonna unify respondent and operant processes is what is a reinforcer compared to an eliciting stimulus, because those are the stimuli involved in those two processes. Well, what our authors, and using lots of references therein, what they argue is that a reinforcer is an eliciting stimulus, as is the punisher. Primary reinforcers and primary punishers are unconditioned stimuli that elicit an unconditioned response. So, we know, our most basic example of classical conditioning, what's the unconditioned stimulus? It's the meat powder, right? Pavlov's dogs. And that elicits a response of salivation. Well, of course, anyone who's had a dog or even knows what a dog is knows that meat or any kind of food can also be used as a reinforcer for teaching an operant response. So we already know this fact that reinforcers are eliciting stimuli. Some behavior analysts talk about a reinforcer as a phylogenetically important event. That reinforcers can be thought of sometimes as reinforcing activities. It's not the food, it's the eating that's a reinforcer. So we already have some practice thinking about reinforcers in different ways, and I think this is a really compelling one, to think of them as eliciting stimuli. So when we want to unify the principle of reinforcement between these two processes, we want to think about the environment and the organism. Now, the environment is a continuous cascade of stimuli, right? When we think about the Skinner box, the operant chamber, it's not just a light and a lever, right? It's the whole box. It's the smell of it. We want to keep it clean, right? Because if you had another rat in there and the other rat peed in there, that's all your rat's going to do is smell that spot, right? So we already know that it's just more than the programmed stimuli. Any environment is a constant cascade of stimuli. When are you not experiencing a stimulus? Well, never. You're always experiencing stimuli. Similarly, the behavior of a living organism is also necessarily continuous. You don't stop behaving. I'm being a little generous with the infinity symbol here. Of course, organisms do pass on and they stop behaving. But until then, it's a constant cascade of behavior, baby. So we've got this concurrent process. Stimuli are always occurring. We're always perceiving stimuli, and we're always behaving, right? In this continual stream, something happens. Something disrupts this cascade, and that is an eliciting event, an unconditioned stimulus and its unconditioned response. A piece of food is dropped in. And that happens in this stream. If it happens reliably after a certain stimulus, stimulus 4 here, then we call that process respondent conditioning. And stimulus 4 will become a conditioned stimulus that will elicit this same response as a conditioned response. If instead this unconditioned stimulus, this elicitor, happens reliably after some response, then that's operant conditioning. And we will see in the future that R4, or response 4, happens more frequently. That's reinforcement, right? These are the same processes, right? And even though something reliably happened right after response 4, it also happened during a cascade of stimuli. Think about this. Think about Skinner's most famous experiment outside of our field, at least, the superstition in the pigeon, right? That was, this event happened not contingent on some behavior, but just after some behavior. Because these lines, you know what I mean? This is not cause. This is just contiguity, temporal contiguity. Just happens after. If it just happens after some stimulus reliably, you get classical conditioning. If it just happens after some response reliably, you get operant conditioning. This could just as easily be stretching your neck up in a superstitious way, in the case of the pigeons, just as easily as it could be a lever press, although probably less likely. But it doesn't change what's going on here. With just one little extra level of complexity, we see how stimulus 3 could always be present when response 4 makes this reinforcement contingency happen, right? Well, we know what that is then. That's stimulus control. We'll now say that stimulus 3 is exerting stimulus control over response 4, and we often call that stimulus the discriminative stimulus, or the SD. Well, now we just have to cut away the rest of the stuff and move these around, and we've got our 3-term contingency, right? So the SD, the response, and the reinforcer is the same type of process, just when it happened, between operant conditioning and respondent conditioning. So isn't that cool, or is it just weird? I hope you think it's cool. So let's look back at this stimulus though, because we talked about a constant cascade of stimuli in the environment. You know, the environment's always there; it's always happening. What exactly is the discriminative stimulus in any one instance? The ongoing stimulus field is not just our programmed SD, right? Right before the lever press, sure, we turned on the light, but also everything else in the environment was present. So anything in the environment could gain stimulus control. What's important is what is present most often when that response is reinforced. So again, we take a wide view of this. This is how our programming for generalization works. If we think of the very simple early intensive behavioral intervention trial that we've probably all done, of teaching a child a listener ID or receptive behavior. I don't like receptive, but touch nose is a very similar, or a very common procedure. You're trying to get the child to listen closely to instructions, right? That's what this is a pre-skill to do. When we're writing this program, or when we're teaching it to our technicians, we say that the SD is touch nose, right? And certainly it is. We're also careful not to touch our own nose, or that would be a model, right? And we would perhaps be training just imitation and not our listener ID. We have to be careful not to touch our own nose. We also want to be careful not to look at the client's nose, because just that subtle downward shift of our eyes could then control the response of touch nose. So we already know that other things could gain evocative control over this response. So when we teach touch nose, we say, just say touch nose, don't look at your nose, don't look at their nose, don't start moving your nose, don't touch your own nose, for gosh sake, just say touch nose. But what else is present during this trial? The table is there, the booth, the reinforcers that you're keeping out of reach, the therapist, you're there, the chair is there, the client's sitting in a chair. That's certainly a stimulus, right? Do you feel a chair when you're sitting in it? You might not think about it too much, but you definitely feel it. You'd feel it if it wasn't there. The client's clothes, you know what I mean? I'm feeling my collar right now. With our present global pandemic, I haven't wore a suit in months. The client's clothes is certainly a stimulus. The smell of the clinic, the hum of the air conditioner, the taste of the last thing the client ate. Perhaps there's residue of the Skittle that you just had for the last trial's reinforcer. The sight and sound and smell of other clients in the room. All those other things are present at the point of this response reinforcement contingency, right? So they all could be gaining, and in any given trial are gaining evocative control. We just want to make sure that the only one is always present, right? Touch nose. But all those other things are just as present as the VSD. I'm saying V because it's not VSD. It's just one of the things that is present. Well, so what? So what if all those things are present? Keeping an eye on that complexity has some immediate applications when we want to arrange for generalization, right? One of the very common ways of arranging for generalization is to program common stimuli in the teaching environment and the testing environment. Well, if you're doing that, if we do that as practitioners, then we must know that those other extraneous things in the environment have some evocative control over that response, right? Why else would we be bringing them into the testing environment? If we keep an eye on complexity and a wide view of stimuli, the environment, and behavior, we will reduce, I hope, the likelihood of appealing to free will, to cognitive structures, to mentalistic behavioral explanations and theorizing, where we get away from our pragmatic approach to our science as Skinner laid out. If we just understand how complex the world is and know that our behavioral principles can explain a lot of this stuff, as long as we don't get too narrow in our focus, then hopefully we'll reduce the likelihood of these things happening. And if we know where errors might come from, any of those other things gaining evocative control over touch nose, if you touch your nose under the presence of those things, we call that an error. If you're sitting in the booth and the AC kicks on and your client touches their nose, that's an error, right? Well, it's only they're responding under control of their environment and how you taught them. It just so happened that the last time a really good trial happened, the AC had just kicked on. So if we know where errors might come from, we can predict those errors, minimize those errors, and better respond to them. So we want to be able to describe, predict, and control the natural world to help people and to help understand our world, right? So I think taking a wider view and keeping in mind how complex everything is one way that we can do that. Okay, let's talk about analyzing covert behavior. This is something that I'm really interested in. Covert behavior, it's so important. And I want to step outside behavior analysis because I want to talk about a success story with another natural science. Let's talk about seeing the unseeable. I've got, speaking of unseeable, my green screen is giving me trouble. This is the constellation Cygnus. Tell I did not take astronomy. Cygnus. I'm gonna say it with my chest. Cygnus. That's Cygnus. And if I'm mispronouncing it, email me. So Cygnus is the Swan or the Northern Cross, and you have one star in Cygnus. And in 1971, astronomers observed that Cygnus X1, that's this one here, was doing weird things. It's 6,000 light years away, and astronomers could see that it was rapidly wiggling. It was moving around in a strange way, and it was losing mass. So that's strange. But there's nothing seeable near the star. Anywhere, it's just a star that's losing mass and wiggling around. So we've got some observed phenomena, and we have principles of physics, right? The laws of physics. So if we take those things and combine them, if we see, well, a star is orbiting a single spot really fast, and it's losing mass, it's emitting X-rays in this wild way. Well, let's take all those observed phenomena and compare them to what we know about the natural world and see what we come up with. Well, what they come up with is that there must be a black hole right next to Cygnus X1. And once they know what to look for or know a little bit about what they might find there, more and more observations confirm that yes, there is a black hole right next to Cygnus X1, relatively speaking, right next to it, that is sucking away some of the star's mass, and the star is circling the drain, so to speak, on a universal scale, is getting sucked into this black hole. So, you take the observed phenomena, you add an interpretation of physics, general relativity, and you get a black hole, right? So here's another example of studying the unseeable. DNA is the blueprint of life. It's pretty important to biochemistry, and of course to all of us. And in biochemistry, structure, or how things are shaped, is actually extremely important, because if you've taken chemistry classes, things fit in with other things, especially like complex proteins and things like that, and biochemical things in your cells have to fit together to work. So it's not enough to think, well, there's some blueprint in there that makes all cells differentiate and turn into the thing that they're supposed to be. We want to know how that happens, right? And knowing how things are shaped is a huge part of that. So what you had was the observed phenomena, but you couldn't observe the actual structure. I mean, in the 1950s, no microscope could directly see DNA. So you take the components, you weigh all the things, you're like, well, this test tube's got DNA in it. What's it shaped like? I don't know, that's my question. But I'm going to weigh it. I'm going to centrifuge it, I'm going to weigh the components of it, I'm going to build models, and then I'm going to do some X-ray crystallography. This is Rosalind Franklin, and this is her crystallography image of DNA. It's like, I think there's DNA right here. Let's shoot a laser through it and see what bounces off. And if you take all those things, all those observed phenomena, and you assume that the natural world is going to work the way the natural world does, from instances where you could observe everything, and you say, well, all right, well, if all these things are true, then you must have this double helix structure. And understanding the structure of DNA was very important for the progression of biochemistry, genetics, biology, etc. So, how can we do those exciting things and find our own version of the DNA helix and the black hole in the Cygnus constellation? We want to know about this fun stuff. This is the funnest stuff there is. This is why people want to study psychology. And Google is quick to kick us while we're down, because they say this really cool image is an image of the mind and the brain. And as a behavior analyst, you got to just throw up your hands at that, because dang it, that's how people understand it, as a mind and a brain, right? Because we haven't answered things. We want to know what organisms are doing, right? That's behavior analysis. Oftentimes, it's very simple what they're doing. It's all overt behavior. We see a rat pressing a lever. The important behavior that we want to study is directly observable, as are lots of other things in the environment that we can manipulate and figure out all the principles of behavior ad nauseum, right? That's really good. This is a little more complicated. We can certainly see this behavior, but we might think, well, what the heck is going on here? But we just take the observed phenomena and we say, like, well, let's watch a little more closely. Let's look at the places that this has happened before, where it happens, where it doesn't. Oh, this bird is looking for food, right? Well, this behavior has been followed by food in the past, right? So again, it's overt behavior, and we have access to the important environmental events. But what about this? Is this behavior? And if you said no, I have to inform you that this person is alive. So we know that they are behaving. And we can see some things. We can see standing. We can see, if we put a mirror under his nose, we could see breathing. But that's not the important behavior, right? We want to know what he's doing, what people are doing. We want to know when people are thinking, and the how, the what, the when, the why. We want to know about thinking. We want to know about problem solving. We want to know about remembering. We want to know about these really cool imagining. We can't see any of that. So we need some application. We need some interpretation of our observed phenomena along with what we know about our principles. And we don't need to be inventing new ones in a time when we can't observe things. That's not how those other problems in natural science were solved. You don't say, well, this thing's spinning around. Well, maybe it's a spinny star and it just loses mass and spins. And that's a new principle. It's like, no. We already figured out the laws of physics. We're going to assume that those are what they are, and we've got some observed phenomena. So what else you got? We don't need new principles at this point. So when I'm asked that question of what are those things, what's going on when people are not doing much at all overtly, first of all, we have to get the unhelpful stuff out of the way, and then we have to go back to this old dusty book. Oh, we dust it off, and what do you know? It's still verbal behavior, B.S. Skinner. So I'm very proud of that animation. So we're going to talk about private events. We're going to talk about covert verbal behavior. That is, it's Skinner's interpretation of our phenomena that we cannot see. Because like those examples from other sciences, natural sciences, we figured out the laws of chemistry, physics, from times when we could observe all the things. And then we say, okay, if those are the rules, then what happens when, how do we figure out what happens over there where we can't do an experiment or we can't even do a good observation? Well, we can use an interpretation, and that will help us to solve those problems. Skinner's interpretation was that private events or covert verbal behavior is just like overt verbal behavior, with some limitations that I'll talk about in a little bit. It's just like overt verbal behavior. It has the same principles. It has the same principles of stimulus control, of generalization. It has frequency of responding. It's reinforced. It's punished. It just exists at a lower magnitude. And one of the things Skinner said was this lower magnitude was probably shaped by punishment and lower response effort. We often talk about building up verbal repertoires in young kids, but as any parent can tell you, after a period where you want the kid to be saying everything, eventually you want them to shh. We apply those subtle social punishers of like, don't say everything you're thinking all the time, right? You can just say it to yourself, right? We explicitly shape up private verbal behavior. Say it to yourself, just to yourself. So we shape our overt verbal behavior into covert verbal behavior by punishment, and there's a lower response effort, presumably, from overt behavior and covert behavior. So this exists along a continuum, right? You could have this guy saying very boldly, I'm a very important person, and that is overt. It has a magnitude. It's observable from lots of people around the room. And then you have someone nearby whispering to an acquaintance, he's not that important. And that's still overt. Oh, there's only one observer because it's at a much lower magnitude. It's just a quieter response. And maybe if the guy is looking at you, you might say, he's not that important, right? You barely saw my lips move. So it's not private, but it is at a lower magnitude. It's harder to observe, right? Well, maybe if you didn't have your friend nearby, or maybe you were across the room, you could just think to yourself, as he's saying, I'm so important, you could just think, I hate this guy. This is my least favorite guy. And you could think that in a way, you could say it to yourself in a way that is not observable from even the person sitting next to you. So you could say it covertly. And Skinner's interpretation of covert verbal behavior is that this is just like overt verbal behavior. It is just at a lower magnitude. That this response was learned just like every other response and is subject to all the principles of behavior that we know and love. So that's a few examples of overt and covert verbal behavior. But no, so if we think that that's how things work, and that's how Skinner thought things worked, and Skinner was right about a lot of stuff, so maybe he's right about this too. But we shouldn't just take an interpretation as fact. When they said, oh, maybe there's a black hole, they didn't stop studying it. They're like, oh, well, if it's a black hole, maybe we'll observe other things. Now we know what to look for. If that's our explanation, we should see also this and this and this. right? If DNA is a double helix, wow, that fits with everything we've seen. That means we'll be able to do this and this and this. That means maybe helicase, RNA helicase works like this. I think I got that right. It's been a while since I took a biology class. So we need to do those things. We don't just take Skinner's word as fact. We say, hey, that's his interpretation. Let's look for other things that would fit. So Skinner pointed to, well, perhaps the physiologists of the future will be able to study private events. And neuroscientists have found lots of neural correlates for behavior, and some of those are very interesting. Some of those are less interesting, only my opinion. There are some neurologists whose explanation seem very much like a behavioral explanation. David Eagleman's explanation of choice and of responsibility seems very much like deterministic, and very much like the things that we're thinking are just like the things that we're doing. So that's one interesting instance. There's a behavior analyst, Daniel Ortu, and his colleagues at UNT. He talks about a behavioral approach to the neurooperant, right? To look at things that are occurring in the brain in a behavioral lens. There's a 2012 paper that he wrote in The Behavior Analyst about this topic, and it's very good. It's not reductionist, it's not dualistic, of course. You know, behavior analysts are not going to say something's going on in the mind. So there's lots of good neuropsych out there, and we can look at the brain during various tasks. You know, that's quite a popular thing to do, but we shouldn't be restricted just to looking at physiology. That's not how we uncovered all the principles of behavior. So we should be able to use some of our methods and look at things in a way that doesn't require brain scans, etc., to look at private events. We should be able to see other things happen when private events are assumedly occurring. So I want to talk about the observable behaviors before, during, and after assumed private events. Well, what we would need is a time or a setup where we think a private event is occurring. So thankfully, there is such a thing, and it's called mediation. And a lot of the work, the behavioral work on mediation, follows from Blau in 1959. And this was a study of pigeons of delayed stimulus control. This paper has been cited almost 500 times. This was a little while ago that I pulled that number up, so who knows what it is now. But the setup here was a stimulus and then two keys that could be lit up. And this sample stimulus was on for 1 second, either a flickering light or just steady on light. And so here the lines indicate that it's flickering. This is a bird's eye view of a pigeon. So you see the top of the bird's head and the beak looking at the sample stimulus. And so it's on for 1 second, and it's flickering here. And then it goes off for 0 to 5 seconds. That's the delay. And then both keys illuminate, one flickering and one steady on. The task, the reinforced behavior, the behavior scheduled for reinforcement, is to peck the key that matches, that has the same properties as the sample stimulus. So in this trial, the reinforced behavior, the behavior scheduled for reinforcement, is the flickering light. So our pigeon pecks the flickering key and gets the seconder of grain, or whatever the reinforcer is in this experiment. So take lots of pigeons through this exact setup, and with every correct response, you increase the delay, and with incorrect responses, enough incorrect responses, you decrease the delay, and you figure out how these pigeons can respond with delayed stimulus control. That's how Blau and others have talked about it. Delayed stimulus control. Well, what Blau found was pretty interesting. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped the end of this trial. There's reinforcement, and then you go back to the next trial. What Blau found was that some birds, during the delay, engaged in different topographies depending on what the sample stimulus was. So, for instance, if the light was flickering, the bird moved its head from side to side throughout the delay and then pecked at the flickering light. If the light was steady, the bird continually pecked at the now dark spot that the sample stimulus was, and then both lights came on, both keys came on, and pecked the solid key. The interpretation there is that this mediation response, or this mediation responding, is controlled by the sample and in turn controls the selection response. So moving your head from side to side is controlled by the flickering light, and you engage in it through the delay. And then when the keys come on, well, that sample key is in the past. It no longer exists, right? It's not here. It's not a stimulus that exists anymore. It existed 5 seconds ago. But what does exist right now is the motion, the proprioception of moving your head side to side. And that controls pecking the key. And similarly, the steady on sample key controlled pecking continuously. And then when the sample keys came up, the pecking the solid key was controlled by the mediation responding. And so Blau found that birds that had different topographies for the different stimuli during the delay engaged in much higher percent correct responding, even when the delay was up to 10 seconds. But birds who engaged in similar topographies for responses throughout the delay, or didn't engage in any kind of observed mediation responding, could not respond correctly even at any longer than 5 seconds from the sample stimulus. So Blau and others who read that subsequently thought, well, maybe that's how remembering works for people too. Maybe when I respond to something, it's because I've been, in the past, because I've been mediating. I've been doing something to bridge the gap. That original thing was controlling some mediational behavior, and now that's what's controlling my response right now. So there's been some other non-human animals, sometimes called mediation. It's sometimes called retention interval responding. So if you're interested in this kind of thing, Chatlosh and Wasserman in 1987 called it retention interval responding. And they also observed between task differences suggested that the same process may not mediate performance in each. So we get some idiosyncratic differences between organisms, and even in the same organism between trials. But we see differences in performance based on those differences in that retention interval responding or mediational responding. So very interesting stuff, right? It's something that says, well, what would prevent that mediational responding in a human from being verbal behavior, and what would prevent it from being covert verbal behavior? So that has led to a lot of mediation research in humans. So they generally fall into two categories that I call block or build. If we want to look at mediational responding, we either have to build the repertoire, so we have to take some organism that likely does not already engage in mediational private verbal behavior and build that repertoire, and then we'll be able to see if our training technique to build that repertoire had subsequent effects even when we can't see the mediational responding. Typically that requires young children or individuals with deficient repertoires, typically that have some developmental disability, and they're taught to engage in mediational responding. And in the other instance, so the advantage to that is that you control the learning history. So you know what led to this change in performance. So if you have a young child that can't engage in this delayed task, and then you teach some mediational technique, and then they can engage in that delayed task, well, you have one thing to clearly point to as a possible explanation for how this delayed stimulus control is now occurring. So that's a pro. You control the learning history that you think might be responsible. But that is also the disadvantage of this, because when we want to learn how things work, making it ourselves only tells us how it could work. It doesn't tell us how it does work. Does that make sense? So if, they could just be what we teach might not be exactly what's occurring for most people or naturally. It might just, the result might look like what we see naturally. So when we control it, we don't always know if that's exactly how it's working in most cases, because we did it ourselves. Even though we see it happening lots of times naturally, in this instance, we did it. So it might not be the same thing. The other technique is taking an organism, a human organism, that already likely has some mediational repertoire that can engage in covert verbal behavior. So some adult who already demonstrates performance where mediation is assumed, and you disrupt, you block that mediation in some way. And in the studies that I have seen, typically that's how that's done is by getting them to engage in other verbal behavior concurrently with the task, and presuming that you can't be engaging in covert verbal behavior and overt verbal behavior at the same time. So the advantage to that is you're studying the population of interest, and you're studying the behavior of interest as it actually exists. This is what I want to explain, how people are able to respond at a delay. So we know that that is the behavior of interest that we're trying to get to the bottom of. The disadvantage, there are very, very, very many. And I'll look at some of these things. I've already alluded to some of them, but I think there are some possible weaknesses to this approach that we're not exactly talking about, and we're treating like it doesn't exist. So, all right, let's look at an example of when we build the repertoire in children. I published a paper with Jessica Frieder and Al Poling in 2016 where I wanted to look at mediation. So I took 3, 4, and 5-year-olds, and I, like, the literature up to that point said, like, well, these 3-year-olds especially, they don't engage in covert verbal behavior. They're not engaging in some rehearsal response. So I'm going to show how they can't do this thing, and then I'm going to teach them how to do it. So that was the plan, but unfortunately, what we got was accurate matching to sample responding without rehearsal. So these kids didn't need to be taught how to rehearse, and in fact, they could engage in this delayed match to sample response even when we engaged they were engaging in concurrent verbal behavior across the delay. So that kind of spun out on this assumption that you would need to be mediating verbally, and that overt behavior was not able to be concurrent with covert verbal behavior. So this was a surprising result. So surprising that even though it was a negative result, it was published. So pretty cool. But that just, of course, raises more questions than it answers. So as a follow-up, I did a study with a student of mine, Michaela Camacho, and we wanted to look at that task more closely, and knowing what we thought would happen, we wanted to look more closely about what the kids were doing during that delay. And could we figure out what kind of tasks were incompatible with their performance in that delay? So we're preparing that submission now, Ratkos and Camacho. So the general setup is a kid tacks a picture card of a common object. You hold up a picture of a tree. They say, "What's that?" And you've already taught them tree. And they say tree, and then you put it away. And then sometime later, 30 seconds, a minute later, you bring out a tray with an array of 8 pictures. One of them is the tree, and the task is to choose what it was. Like, what was it? Or find it, right? And we did different tasks across the delay. We looked at showing them other distractor cards, other picture cards that were not the target card. We interviewed them about age-appropriate things, like what's your favorite color? Do you like cartoons? Do you like to play tag? Do you like hide and seek? Just talking as a child does. And then for a third distractor task, we did a tangram activity. If you're familiar with tangrams, it's little plastic polygons that you fit together to make different pictures or to match to a pattern. So that is distracting, but it doesn't require you to talk. So we had this visual card distractor the interview distractor, which is very verbal, the kids talking and listening the whole time, and the tangram, which is certainly distracting but not verbal. And what we found was pretty idiosyncratic, as you see from these 9 participants' individual data. We've got the percentage correct after the delay and the distractor type. So as we see in the top left there, Molly could do the task no problem when we interviewed her across the delay, and no problem when she was playing with the tangrams. But if we showed her different picture cards during the delay, she's never going to find that card from the original tact trial. Sam, however, in the middle top column there, he performed pretty well with all 3 distractor tasks. He was the weakest in the interview, but that's pretty good performance across all 3 of these. So there's idiosyncratic responding. Kyle could, in the direct middle there, could respond great when we interviewed him, but you tell him to do the tangrams or you show him different picture cards and performance falls apart. So idiosyncratic, but the card distractor was, across the most participants, the most disruptive. So not having them engage in different blocking verbal tasks, but just having them look at other cards is what was disruptive to most of these kids. So that tells us that, well, certainly delayed stimulus control is not universally verbally mediated, and stimulus control is not that straightforward. Like, looking at the cards might lead us to believe that there is some delayed effect of just the visual, and it's disrupted by seeing other cards. Then we could look at physiological things like an after image, or we could start to ask other questions. But this is what we found when we tried to look at tasks during that delay. So with adults, previous studies have looked to block the repertoire. Seidner and Michael in 2006 did delayed selection mediated by hand signs. So they looked at different images that were rotated in different ways and taught adults to orient their hand in the same way as the picture, and then either just hold it like that, and then after the delay they could match their hand to the image. They could also transform their hand. It's like, okay, that, and let's turn it 90 degrees, and then, okay, after the delay, well, this one matches that error right there. So this physical mediator, and when you prevent the participants from doing that physical mediator, performance breaks down. So it was a good example of this disrupting mediation working. Other studies have looked at a sequencing task where you have to put things in order according to their names that you've been given, and then to disrupt mediation to be told to sing. And in Gutierrez 2006, the participants were told to sing "Wheels on the Bus" during the delay, which prevented most participants from engaging in that mediation, and subsequently ruined their performance on this delayed sequencing task. Some more recent examples, Kyle Miguel has been working on this, so some people from his lab have been doing some work in this area. Meyer and Miguel in 2016, and you might also see Miguel 2018 in Behavior Analysis Research and Practice. The Clow is in Analysis of Verbal Behavior. So Sundberg and Michael in 2018 disrupted labeling during a matchless sample task. So we've got some people looking at this arrangement, and I think we're getting some interesting results, but we're kind of just, I think, in a rut, and I want to get us out of this rut. And that students from the previous study, Michaela Camacho, for her honors thesis, she's an undergraduate now going into graduate school this fall. She did an honors thesis where we looked at a very interesting manipulation of this task, specifically the one from Clow, Meyer, and Miguel 2016. So that manuscript's in preparation, but I want to tell you about it and show you some results of that. So this is similar to some of the other sequencing tasks. We've got these abstract figures. You teach the participants to tact them, and you teach them to arrange them in a sequence under control of just another identical set of them, which is very simple to do. and under just control of me telling you what the sequence is. So once you learned to tact all these, I could say Yaf, Jam, Lin, Kev, and then I hand you all these, and then you have to put the cards in that order. And what most participants do is they repeat over the sequence that the experimenter has just said to them as they arrange the picture cards, until the arrangement of the picture cards and tacting them matches what they're echoing. And that's a very overt and very elegant example of the verbal mediation involved in that specific task. And the results of it have been replicated a few times, and they look really good. And Michaela Camacho and I also replicated those exact same results. But what we added, or what she added, and I was helping on this, was we added some tactile stimuli. Rather than using these, I mean, we used these for one experiment, but then in another experiment, we used tactile pillows, texture pillows, I like to call them. And you learned to tact the feeling of these while you were blindfolded. So instead of looking at them and learning the tact, a visual tact, it was a tactile tact. It gets a little hard to say. So, and then I could tell you the order of the pillows and then hand you the pillows. And you could repeat that order as you arrange them, but as in previous studies, in some trials, your mediation was blocked. And in this case, in this experiment, we had participants say the alphabet in order repeatedly throughout the trial. So these are the data for the sequencing picture cards, which is just a replication of Miguel's lab's study, and we got the exact same results. Just to orient you, these are different 5 trial blocks. This looks more complicated than it is if you read Kaio's student's paper. It becomes very apparent what's going on here. You've got the task when you can mediate, and then the task when you can't. And what you see is a decrement in performance from when you can mediate your responding to when you cannot, or when it's blocked. So you get performance gets worse across, in this instance, this is Camacho's replication, got worse in every instance. Now, these are 4 different participants. Now, instead, when we looked at sequencing tactile stimuli blindfolded, we did the same thing. Of course, when mediation is not blocked, you can do this task very easily. Performance is very high. But when you block, what we saw was some participants, 2 of 4 participants, had same kind of degradation in performance that they had with the visual stimuli card, of course different participants, but the same kind of performance decrements that we saw with the other participants, but some had no change in performance at all. That it appears that this supposedly what is blocking verbal mediation, saying the alphabet over and over, engaging in an overt verbal response, was not having any effect on performance of sequencing these tactile stimuli. So what does that mean? What it means was that while vocal blocking inhibited performance when sequencing visual stimuli, replicating Clow et al. 2016, verbal mediation may not be necessary when sequencing tactile stimuli blindfolded. So I think what we're seeing in these differences in results is a result of common learning histories, that we're commonly naming and looking at things that we know the names of, and we have strategies that we've learned. And so those things work in specific ways. But just because there's a lot of common learning history around naming objects and responding to objects by naming them, we don't necessarily have that same learning history with other types of tasks or other types of sensations. So if that is the case, then we aren't learning something about private events at large. We're only learning about that specific type of task. If we can disrupt it and get different results by changing the task very slightly, We're no longer finding out something about behavior analysis. We're finding out something about one specific task, which to me is not as interesting. And I think we need to broaden our scope when we look at those types of tasks and all the types of things we're doing in behavior analysis. So, why is it so easy to get results that don't support the literature or the literature doesn't support? It's because we assumed covert verbal behavior shares too many, I think, characteristics with overt verbal behavior. The only thing that we should assume, I would argue, is that covert verbal behavior follows the principles of behavior, of stimulus control, reinforcement, discrimination, generalization, etc. Not that it has all the limitations and characteristics of overt verbal behavior. It's over assuming to think that it has the limitations and structure of overt speech out loud. So there's more complexity that can happen with covert verbal behavior necessarily, because overt verbal behavior has certain even physical limitations that covert verbal behavior may not. So what about joint control? I haven't talked a lot about joint control. This is a little visual humor. We're not talking about controlling quickly, often legalized substance. We're talking about the control of one response with two different stimuli, right? And a lot of these papers that I've been talking about the authors are calling them joint control, because you have the stimulus, the comparison stimulus itself, or the stimulus arrangement of sequence of stimuli, and the either the instruction from the experimenter or the picture cards laid in front of them that will match each other, that will jointly control one response, right? So I know what you're thinking. Well, if I haven't had to talk about it since now, as far as I can tell, in my opinion, all joint control is convergent multiple control. And the fact that we are able to discriminate the jump in response strength is interesting, but I don't think that it necessitates a terminological separation from multiple control. If you are rehearsing something to yourself and that is what is selecting out from divergent multiple control, let's just call it that, or talk about it in those ways. When we invent new terms, it begs the question: is this a new principle? Well, if it's just directly from what we already know, I think it's not helpful to call this instance of multiple control joint control for, I think, insufficient reasons. So going on, I think that we cannot afford to be rigid or dogmatic in our approach, in our understanding, in our interpretation of these phenomena. We need to ask questions that we don't know the answer to which we don't know the answer. So we did not know, Michaela Camacho and I, we did not know what would happen when we blindfolded the participants. She had the idea of, well, what if these things were not visual? What if they were tactile? I said, I don't know. And she said, oh, well, maybe we shouldn't do that. It's like, no, that means we should do it. If we don't know the answer, we definitely should do it. So we didn't know the answer, and we got an interesting result. A variety of methods and angles of attack are our best bet if we're going to uncover these mysteries of covert behavior and private events. We don't want to get dogmatic and say, well, this is how we do it. We have them do something out loud, and then we have them sing this thing or repeat this thing, and that's called blocking. And if they do something good, then they didn't mediate, and if they don't, we want to go from a variety of angles at this problem. We need to think pragmatically and use our VB-informed Skinnerian lens. I think there's still a lot in verbal behavior that we still can be using the interpretations of to answer a lot of questions. Another thing I'll bring up, and it relates to the weakness of building the repertoire. We sometimes have mediational approaches, and sometimes these are applied things. If you're familiar with Joanne Robbins' Talk Aloud Problem Solving or Think Aloud Problem Solving, TAPS, it shapes up a problem-solving repertoire, right? And when we teach mediation, it gets to a result that looks like other things. But we know that most people do not have that specific programmed learning history. I think I can solve problems pretty well, but I didn't get to go through Joanne Robbins' Talk Aloud problem solving. So the fact that the kids that go through Talk Aloud problem solving solve problems very well, that's excellent. But that doesn't mean that how they were taught is what is going on for everybody. So most people learn how to remember and problem solve. They're taught by a throw you in the deep end approach, right? You just the conditions are arranged where if you can do these things, remembering and problem solving, reinforcement will be forthcoming, hopefully. But we are not teaching everyone systematically. So when we want to know how people writ large remember, or how people at large solve problems, we don't want to run into the make the error that just because we can teach it in one way, that is how everybody is doing it. So most people do not learn systematically, so we should not assume a systematic approach when we're trying to understand. Now, applied, this is obviously and empirically a really good way to get kids to solve problems, so its strength is an applied technique. I'm not discounting that at all, but in the same way that when we build the repertoire, we shouldn't over assume that is how it works in everyone. So the repertoires that come out the other side of these approaches may not resemble each other or what we would approximate with intentional curricula. So how I solve problems, how you solve problems, how you think, how I think, we can get someone to do something like that, but we may be doing it very differently than how we got someone else to do it. So I would argue that thinking is analogous to speech, that covert verbal behavior does not have the physical restrictions of overt speech. Skinner pointed out in verbal behavior that these were clearly at a lower magnitude because if you opened your mouth really wide and stuck out your tongue and thought the word bubble, that you could perceive your larynx in the back of your tongue moving. And I've done that myself. It was very fun. I won't do it on camera, but I encourage you all to do it. That if you lean your head way back, open your mouth real wide, stick out your tongue, and think the word bubble, 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 you may feel your speech motor arrangement, your larynx in the back of your tongue, move. So it's like, well, wow, it seems like thinking is just saying it very, very little. But we can, that hasn't been selected out, right? That hasn't been shaped out, that small movement of the back of your throat when you're thinking bubble, because it hasn't bothered anybody. No one said quiet down when your larynx twitched when you said bubble. So it hasn't experienced the same subtle social punishers or reduction in response strength. It's very easy, imperceptible almost, to slightly twitch the back of your throat. And so that does not mean that the physical apparatus is involved in all covert verbal behavior. Additionally, you can think things that you cannot say. You can think the sound of a violin. And when you think about the fact that you can do that, it very quickly breaks down this approach that covert verbal behavior is overt verbal behavior at a lower magnitude. Because there's something about the sound of a violin that I cannot do, but I can imagine the sound of a violin. What we don't want to do is just start inventing a lot of things, because cognitive psychology has a visuospatial sketchpad and a phenomenological loop. I can never say that one. But the visuospatial sketchpad is hypothetical, mentalistic, and not causal. However, that does not mean that I can't close my eyes, imagine a three-dimensional figure, and then rotate it, right? So if we don't want to just invent a bunch of cognitive structures, we need to be able to talk about those things in behavior analytic ways. And if we stick to private events are just like overt speech, well, then how am I able to, look at a three-dimensional figure when there's no three-dimensional figure present? We need to be varied in our approach, and we need to be asking these kind of questions and coming up with ways to look at that, which I think will be fun and interesting. All right, let's change gears a little bit. Let's talk about autoclitics. All right, as you remember, autoclitics are the verbal operant that's controlled by the speaker's own verbal behavior and some MO for a specific effect on a listener. And as I mentioned previously, we're going to talk about the descriptive autoclitic, which is the controlled by the speaker's own verbal behavior and the source of control of the primary response. So a very easy example of that is if you say it's raining. If you say to a listener it's raining, that's a tact, right? Your response, raining, is controlled by some nonverbal stimuli in the environment, right? And the listener can now respond as if they had come into contact with that part of the world, and they can respond as if they have seen that it's raining. If, however, you say, I think it's raining, then that's a very different effect on the listener. The listener knows a little bit about the source of control of your tact of listening. Specifically, they know that it's weak. And if you're wrong, they may not come back and apply a social punisher. If you say, it's raining outside, and they go outside and it's not raining, they could say, you jerk, it's not raining. I carried my umbrella all the way out here. But if you say, I think it's raining, then they're going to behave accordingly. And if you're wrong, they're not going to come at you and say, hey, you jerk, you said it was raining, because you could simply say, hey, I only said I thought it's raining. I specifically informed you of the weakness of my tact. Hopefully you don't talk like that, but maybe if you're both behavior analysts. Similarly, you could say, I heard that it's raining, or you can say lots of different things about rain. So those are descriptive autoclitics, those things that you modify the primary tact, raining. Now, autoclitics are something that has been analyzed in the literature. I had a bunch here, but I have not arranged them in a way that they come out one at a time. But rest assured, people are talking about autoclitics. This is a really interesting one, actually. Analysis of autoclitic in pigeons, which I think is super cool. The rest of these are applied instances where people with deficient verbal repertoire, specific most of the time children with deficient verbal behavior, are taught to engage in autoclitics, right? Which brings us back to what I was just talking about, that if you teach someone to respond in some way, that's great, but it is not the same thing as observing and describing what we see in the natural world, right? No one would argue that you couldn't get someone to say something under some control that you arranged in the lab. We're behavior analysts. That's exactly what we could do. We could do it so well. But that is not the same as an analysis of autoclitics as Skinner described them. Because Skinner didn't say, you could teach someone to do this. He said, this is what people do and why they do it. So I think... I would love to uncover a corpus of research that I had not seen previously, but I think we skipped that part of science where we took Skinner's analysis and said, let's confirm all the things that he said as interpretations. So I'm interested in doing that, and autoclitics I think are very low-hanging fruit because I don't think anyone's done much with them. So let me tell you about what I did with a couple of students. And all credit to the execution of this project by two amazing undergraduates, Aubrey McFadden and Annie Small, both going to graduate programs here in the fall. So we will have undergraduates at Berry College. I didn't mention that in my introduction, but all my research with students is with undergraduate students. So we wanted to observe, not teach, autoclitics because we want to see if they are, in fact, how Skinner described them. So we showed college students pictures, okay? Pictures, common objects. That now you're thinking, all this guy does is show people common object pictures. I showed college students common object pictures that had been distorted, digitally distorted, at 3 levels of distortion that made them relatively easy or hard to even see. And what we looked for was autoclitics, modifying a tact. We know these college students could tact an apple and a ladder and a shoe, but what we wanted to see is if the varied distortion or the varied salience of these stimuli controlled how often they would engage in autoclitics to modify those tacts. So our dependent variable was an autoclitic modifying a tact. So let me show you some of these images. This is three examples of images. So on the far left there is an apple that's very salient, so it has low distortion. These terms are in opposition to each other. High salience means low distortion. Low salience means high distortion. So we've got a very salient, very slightly distorted. We just have this pattern, this very slight mosaic filter applied to the apple. And then we have the same mosaic and also a wavy filter through this open source image software called Glimpse. So we set these pictures through a couple of filters in that program. And then for this chair, this is the highly distorted chair. So this is the same two filters, but just at a more extreme level set by the program. So you could do it in a very predictable way. So we had 35 pictures in all, and we distorted every picture in, so these are these same images, but at different distortion levels. So a very lowly distorted chair, moderately distorted apple, and highly distorted clock, and then the low distorted clock, moderately distorted chair, and highly distorted apple. So we distorted all the pictures in all the ways, but each participant would only be exposed to one set of pictures. So if you saw a very salient apple, you wouldn't see a medium or low salience apple. That other participants see that. So we counterbalanced those because we didn't want students to participants to see a high salience apple and then be looking for, be much easier to identify that that's an apple if you've already seen that apple. So they only saw one apple. It just might have been at one of three distortion levels, and we counterbalanced them across sets. And then we just asked them, what do you see? And measured how often they engaged in autoclitics. So here are some examples. Adding I think before or after the tact indicates that it's a weaker tact. Adding I don't know before or after the tact, like apple, I don't know, or I don't know, apple. So either side of I think or I don't know. Kind of looks like or like also weakens the tact, so we counted those as autoclitics. Asking rather than stating, so putting it in a sentence that is a question, is it a deer? Would be autoclitic, modifying the tact to deer. One thing, just as an aside, what we didn't do is if they just said the tact word but it sounded like a question, we that got too subjective, so we didn't count those as autoclitics, only if they had autoclitic words. I want to say it's so that's an autoclitic. I'll go with, that's a popular one for kids. I'll go with apple. Tells you that I'm not very sure. Combinations were observed as well. I'm probably wrong, but it kind of looks like an apple. Yeah, that's an autoclitic. Okay, so let's see what happened. We took a lot of students through this procedure, 32 students. Let's see what happened. These are averages for the participants. So the average percentage of autoclitics evoked by arranged by picture salience. So we've got the low salience or high distorted in the red, medium salience, and then high salience in the green, which there's no green bar here because there's less than 1%. So 18% of trials across the whole study, and I'll give you some individual data in a minute, 18% of trials with low salience pictures evoked an autoclitic modifying the tact. So 18% of the time we heard, I think it's a, or maybe it's a, or I don't know, it's a. For medium salience or moderate distortion, we got 9% of trials evoked some autoclitic. And for the high salience, for the very low distortion, the clearest pictures, we got 0.3, one trial out of 320, I think, Don't quote me on that. But less than 1% autoclitics for a high saliency object. Here's some individual data. This is autoclitics by picture salience, and these participants are sorted by the difference between low and medium salience autoclitics evoked. Okay, so the highest difference in autoclitics is on the far left there. So you see that participant had something like 58% of the low salience trials an autoclitic was emitted, and only 18% of medium salience, and then no high salience autoclitics. So what do we see here? We see 20 participants, or 63%, used autoclitics most often with low salience images, which is exactly what Skinner would predict based on his analysis or interpretation of the descriptive autoclitic. 8 participants, 25%, didn't use any autoclitics for any trial. So they just never said an autoclitic. Right or wrong, we weren't really interested in if they got the tact right or wrong, although we have this data. But 8 participants, a quarter of the participants, just never said an autoclitic. And 4 participants used autoclitics, these people over here, they used autoclitics more often with medium salience images. So there are a few of those that less often, although some of them did use it with low salience images. So we get some individual differences, but we clearly get a pattern. And then the last thing I'll point out is there's our one trial with our high salience image evoking an autoclitic. That's that tiny little green bar over there on one participant. So this is what Skinner predicted from his analysis of descriptive autoclitics. So interesting. And as far as I can tell, has not been done before. And you may be thinking, it's like, well, it's just like Skinner said. It's like, well, it's very different to say, hey, this is what Skinner said, and here's the data to back it up, versus this is what Skinner said, and then you just walk away and hope they don't ask, well, I thought you were in empirical science. I mentioned that we broke things into sets, so we didn't know if, like, just luck of the draw, if some medium salience images would be easier to tact than others. So this is the by set. So each participant only got one set. So the pattern was the same. It was roughly twice as often that, any way you broke it down, it was roughly twice as often that you would use an autoclitic with a low salience image than with a moderate salience image. And then the one autoclitic that was evoked from a high salience image was in set B. Pretty consistent across sets, across participants, with some individual differences and some just non-responders. Some people didn't emit autoclitics, but pretty interesting. One thing that occurred to me during and after this study is that by observing how people emit autoclitics, what conditions make autoclitics evoked, what we are actually studying is the practices of the verbal community, and it's kind of a secondary measure of common learning history or common practices for a verbal community. Because remember way back I talked about that we're just trying to put nature into boxes, right? The autoclitics, as Skinner laid them out, is an interpretation of our verbal community, and is a result of Skinner's learning history being what it is. It's much like many of our learning histories, but if our verbal community was very different, if our language was very different, I would expect that we would see differences in these autoclitic studies depending on every demographic factor. Regional, race, gender, I would expect it wherever we saw differences in people and differences in the way people talk. Language, of course, but if we observe how people talk, we're actually just studying the practices of the verbal community, because that's where those things come from, right? Autoclitics don't just form in the autoclitic section of our mind, right? They're learned. So what we're measuring is a common learned experience. Perhaps, though, I think this is one instance where we should be looking at what's happening naturally and not only teach what we think is happening or what we think should happen. So when we're teaching, things like remembering, problem solving, even the use of autoclitics in those with deficient verbal repertoires, we shouldn't just rely on what we think happens and teach that, but we should first, or at least, we should catch up and look at what is happening naturally. Why wouldn't we teach our learners, our clients, how to respond when the strength of their tact is very weak, right? And we want them to be understood by their peers in the larger verbal community. So we need to look at the common practices of that verbal community, and I think that's what I've done here. Okay, let's change gears. Let's talk about some fun things. Let's bring together a bunch of stuff that we've been talking about and look at a behavior analytic understanding of projective testing. Projective tests are something that's been used in psychology for many, many years, many different types of them. I'm going to go over some common types. Some you've probably heard of, some you might not have heard of. Much of the information that I'm talking about here with the non-behavioral techniques of projective testing are from the Corsini Encyclopedia of Psychology. So that's where a lot of this comes from. I'm not a psychology historian. I've learned some things, so I just thought I'd tell you where some of this information is coming from. The one that you're probably most familiar with is the Rorschach ink blot method. Herman Rorschach in the 1920s developed this projective test. Consists of black and white and colored ink blots, actually made with folding over ink that's on a page, and then creating a more or less symmetrical image that is vague. And the prompt during a Rorschach ink blot test is to show a person the ink blot and say, what might this be? So let's look at some of these. These are some of the original ink blots from Herman Rorschach's original studies. These 10 were chosen because they seem to evoke different responses from the disturbed population versus the non-disturbed population. So in creating lots of different things, Rorschach showed these to lots of people that were not institutionalized and that were, and found that the ones that he selected evoked different responses in institutionalized or disturbed people. So, looking at this, similarly to the pictures I showed you, the divergent stimulus control pictures, these might evoke different tacts, right? And in this case, it wouldn't be a specific set of tacts that I could guess at. It might be very different person to person, and we'll talk about why that might be. So the methods for administering the Rorschach test varied widely until there was some standardization in the 1970s. The current version, people still do an ink blot. The current version codes responses in the participants for 150 different variables and combinations of variables, and is used in forensic and juvenile and lots of different applications of clinical psychology. So this is not just a historical thing. This is a currently used method. Interestingly, you might be surprised that when used with fidelity, the Rorschach ink blot has excellent reliability between examiners and has retest correlations above 75% across days and even across years in some studies. So showing people these images, getting them to respond, and then coding those responses has some retest validity or retest reliability and inner experimental reliability. So it's second only to the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory as the most common personality test for adolescents. So yeah, these are just some things that what might this be? More than a third of forensic psychologists use inkblot in their methods. So in looking at these ambiguous stimuli, and that's what they are, of course, they're created ambiguously. It's not like Rorschach was like, oh, well, if I do an inkblot here and fold it over, it will look like a... No, it's ambiguous, it's accidental if it has any kind of shape to it. But in looking at these ambiguous stimuli, we tact them. The tacts are very weak, and they have supplemental strength from our learning history. and they are the spilled coffee of our broad learning history, right? So they allow us to make weak tacts out loud. They allow us to emit weak verbal responses. So here's another personality test, the thematic apperception test. Henry Murray and Christiana Morgan in 1943. These were picture cards of various figures. I'll show you some. And patients were asked to describe the picture, what led to the picture, what their thoughts about the picture were, their feelings, and what might happen after the picture. So here we see a child looking at a violin, and might be bored, might be kind of sleepy. There was 31 cards originally. They were separated by gender and age specific, so applied to people that had. So this one would be shown to children or perhaps to young boys. Here's another image. So looking at this image and then what are your feelings? What led to this? What happens after this? Right? This is vague, and with those questions, we start to combine tacts from this with intraverbals from those questions, combined with our learning history and what are the responses that we emit under those conditions. Here's another picture. We start to form tacts about this. This one's especially ambiguous. What would it mean if you saw this figure as having a good nap after a hard day's work versus a dead body, right? What learning history would lead you to tact this one way or the other? So that's presumably what the types of things that are being asked about from these projective tests. Here we see something that's a little more ambiguous. Now I see like a tail over here, like a dragon's tail, and there's some figure on this pedestal. So I immediately go to Dungeons and Dragons, but that's just me. So another projective test is the Rotter Incomplete Sentence Blank from 1950. Julian Rotter. Every old psychologist got to name everything after themselves, so isn't that fun? This mostly was used with children and adolescents, and it consisted of 40 incomplete sentences. So here we're looking at intraverbal control, not tact control, but intraverbal control combined with a learning history and present situation. So I like, and then complete the sentence. The happiest time, and then we get some response from our patient. Back home, how would you complete that sentence? So these are all intraverbals, intraverbal probes. The verbal summator, you'll be interested to know, is a projective test that was invented by B.F. Skinner. Yes, that same B.F. Skinner in 1936, and it consisted of repeated nonsense syllables. So the Rorschach and the pictures were tact control, and then we saw that previous one, the incomplete sentences, Rotter incomplete sentences, were intraverbal control, and now we see Skinner's is intraverbal combined with echoic probes. And so these repeated nonsense syllables, so rather than seeing something that isn't a real image and then tacting it, in the verbal summator you were hearing words that weren't really words, they were just nonsense syllables. And the task was, what do you hear? And Skinner said that the weakness of the echoic stimulus must be matched by special strength from another source. And examples of this kind are revealing. So it's like, wow, we've got Skinner talking about revealing your what? Your unconscious? Well, no, of course not. Your weakly controlled verbal behavior. And Skinner said it uncovered latent speech. And remember back to that Palmer diagram, below emitted behavior is latent behavior. What kind of things could you engage in? Now, if we just push everything up, now what kind of things will you engage in? So we're trying to reveal latent speech with the verbal summator. Here's the schematics that Skinner drew up. It's basically just a record player that has a repeater function, and he found out after the fact that someone had already invented this for repeating sounds, but I don't know if Skinner got a patent for this or not. But he published the schematic of the device and the guidelines for its use and some data from his own experiments in 1936. It was later renamed the Tautophone, and perhaps as effort to distance it from Skinner and to free up theory building, because some people that were not behavior analytic got a hold of the verbal summator and had some fun with it, building top-down theories as they were wont to do. Here I can put in some examples of Skinner's own voice, because the things that he created for the verbal summator were his own voice. So let's listen to that. I'm going to add them in post, so I'm just going to stand here and act like I can hear it.
I,
Okay, so that was Skinner saying some nonsense sounds, and the task was to, as soon as you can hear what he's saying, you say it out loud, right? And of course, the sample is not saying anything, right? But the people that were given this verbal summator task were not told that it's nonsense sounds. They're just like, this is kind of hard to hear, but try and figure out what is being said. So then you're listening, and it's like, oh, he's saying alphabet soup and a box of paper. Whatever you hear. And that was supposed to reveal some latent speech. And I want to share with you a very interesting, albeit a bit crass, example of this from Murray Sidman's 2002 paper, Notes from the Beginning of Time from the Behavior Analyst. And Sidman writes, talking about the verbal summator, "We once tried this with a friend as a subject. The friend told us that he was hearing, 'I am a cuckold. I am a cuckold.' Perhaps it was just coincidence, but we happened to know that his wife was having an affair, and we lost our nerve, put the summator away, and hoping someday we might know enough about the environmental control of verbal behavior to understand what was happening." And that's Murray Sidman recounting a time that they were using the verbal summator, and of course, as he said, it could be coincidental, but perhaps revealed some latent verbal behavior from a man whose wife was being unfaithful, and then saying, like, identifying that in a special kind of way of saying, "I am a cuckold," is not something you would typically say, right? But, and I'll come back to this later, it can be very, very freeing to emitting latent speech to have understood in your listeners that you are not the source of strength, right? If you are saying, well, what I'm hearing is, then you're telling your listener, this isn't me saying that, this is what I'm hearing. So, but if what you're hearing is actually nothing, then Sidman was scared off of the whole experiment rather than tell his friend, that's not what was said, and this is awkward. So the common features of all these projective tests are that the responses are outside conscious awareness. Of course, that's not how Skinner put it, but it's very similar to how Skinner put it. In the stimuli, there is ambiguity. There is no right answer. None of the Rorschachs, none of the pictures, none of the incomplete sentences, and certainly none of the speech sounds in the verbal summator have a right answer. So there's ambiguity in the stimulus. And most of the theories outside of the summator, but even with the summator later on when it got into other people's hands, most of the theories were not behavior analytic at all. So people's interpretations for what was going on are that it reveals something about the unconscious, et cetera, and probably why behavior analysts haven't been very interested in engaging with these types of tasks, because you see how people talk about it and you say, well, that's not behavior analysis. Who cares, right? Well, yeah, you might think this, like, I don't even know about that junk. I'm a behaviorist. I don't even know about unconscious nonsense. Well, I hate to say it, but the behavior of people in projective tests is behavior. So many of these tests are, have varying levels of empirical validation. But some of them have a lot of empirical validity, and they're used by professionals. And their behavior. So why wouldn't we, as behavior analysts, be able to talk about them? We can take our same analysis of multiple control and think about what controls the responses that the patients or clients emit. We have the therapist in the office. We have the questions themselves, what do you see, or etc. And then you have these vague stimuli, right? The response is a statement which reveals something in, the psychoanalyst and in Skinner's terms, reveals something about your weakly controlled verbal behavior. If all behavior comes from somewhere, all behavior is determined, and we know that the response is not determined by that ink blot because it's very vague and ambiguous, then it is revealing something about your latent behavior. And if we look at it through that lens, we can ask some very pointed questions. How can we manipulate some of these things by exposing someone to something very soon preceding the experiment, etc., etc. So, be not afraid, radical behaviorists. You can talk and analyze weird stuff that some people might have very strange explanations for, and we can use our same lens to analyze it. So this is behavior. We have lots of tools that's required to analyze behavior, and we could point our analysis at these tests and improve them and use them to further our science. Wouldn't that be nice? All right, so summation. Skinner talked about the verbal summator as these nonsense sounds that we heard a minute ago as adding together to push forward and have emitted latent speech. But projective tests, this is me talking, projective tests may work not by adding stimulus control, or not only by adding stimulus control, but by reducing the effects of previous punishment. When you say, or when you think the source of control is some external entity, you don't engage in self-editing, which is a whole other chapter at the end of verbal behavior, which you should take a look at, right? You wouldn't go up to someone and say, ugly, right? Because that would be horrible. But you would go up to someone, and if they said, hey, read this, and you open it up and it said ugly, you say, ugly, right? I'm not the source of control. This paper is the source of control. It's a task response. Everybody knows it. There's no punishment for reading, right? So here's an example of that. And then he said, F him and F you too. Right? That's an example of when the source of control and when the listener understands the source of control, you can say he said, F him and F you too. Well, I wouldn't say that to you. He said it. But, I mean, literally, you are saying it. Literally, when you open it up and say ugly, you're saying ugly to a person. So I think that these projective tests can work in that same way. When you and the listener, and your listener, understand, that you are not the source of control, you are able to omit things you may otherwise edit. So if back to, those vague pictures of figures, you know what I mean, of the violin. If you said, oh, that kid's worried that his dad's gonna slap his hands with rulers unless he gets the violin right, and it's like, oh, that's about me. You know what I mean? Not about me, but you could say that about this boy, and you wouldn't self-edit, but you wouldn't say it about yourself. Because that would be, it would elicit feelings of, guilt and shame, and, you would want to hide that from other people. So freeing people from the effects of punishment, I think, is a very important part of these projective tests. And all these things I've just mentioned with projective tests and all the things about multiple control that I've said leading up to this point apply to another very interesting bit of complex verbal behavior, and that is the behavior of psychics in a psychic reading. So before I get too far into this, I want to tell y'all that I'm not a kook. I don't believe in magic. So I'm going to talk about psychics because that is the role that they are playing, not because they have some special power. And actually, the truth is stranger than fiction, and I'm interested in the physical world and in the behavior analytic way that their behavior is determined. So when I say a psychic, I mean someone who engages in a psychic reading, not someone with magic powers. Okay, so back to Skinner and verbal behavior. He said some specific things about vague stimuli in a section on self-probes. So he talked about the descriptive autoclitic function here. The source of control is in the crystal ball, the cards, etc., not me. So it's ascribing control to something else. It's the I heard it's raining, not it's raining. So ascribing the control to something else. And it reduces the labor, these are Skinner's words, it reduces the labor of verbal invention. So similar to the verbal summator and all projective tests, if you just give someone something to look at or hear or an intraverbal, it reduces just like come up with something like say words. You know what I mean? I mean, how good of a projective test would that be if you just sat someone down in a featureless room and said, for the next 30 minutes, say words. It's like, well, I guess that would reveal their latent speech, but they may not engage in any. So here's a quote from page 407 of Verbal Behavior. Verbal self-probes are exemplified by the patterns taken by tea leaves and fortune-telling cards. When a pattern corresponds roughly to verbal responses already in some strength, it functions as a probe, and a particular fortune is read. So that underline is my emphasis added. Already in some strength. So it's latent. Those responses are already in the repertoire. They're just unemitted. They have strength, and if we add strength to them with these vague stimuli, we can get our participant to emit those. So let's talk about psychic readings, or a cold reading as it's called. The speaker is the psychic. I'm going to talk about the behavior of the psychic, and the customer is the listener in this instance. So there's lots of different examples of psychic readings. There's with crystal balls. There's this is Madame Cleo or Aunt Cleo. I forget, but she used to have like you could call up and for $10 a minute she'd tell you your fortune. This guy is at the lowest skill level. John Edwards does like cold readings where he says he's going to talk to your dead relatives. There's tea leaves being read, palmistry or reading a palm, and then here's an example from a movie of someone who and there's some historical examples of this too, of using lots of psychoactive drugs and then predicting the future or going somewhere with that. So that one's a little different, but if you've ever used psychoactive drugs, they do reduce the labor of verbal invention. So I would only hide that comment here 2 hours into a talk and not put it right up front. Okay, so most of my knowledge about cold reading is from this very good book by Ian Rowland. Wow, it's a little bit too green to be shown, but there it is on the screen. The Full Facts of Cold Reading. It's a very interesting book. So there are some common elements to all these things. There's an introduction or interaction between the customer and the psychic. Then there's the reading itself. And in that introduction, the psychic has certain goals. The goals are, and I'll put these in behavioral terms, the goal is to establish yourself as a positive audience. So you can emit verbal behavior around me and I will approve. A psychic is someone who's easy to talk to and encourages you to talk to them, right? That's why you're there, to talk to them. So they want to establish themselves as a positive audience that evokes lots of verbal behavior. They also want to evoke and reinforce statements of cooperation. The psychic's goal, one of the goals of the psychic, as Ian Rowland puts, and I transform into behavioral terms, is I want to say that we're in this together, and anything that's us, I want to reinforce those kind of statements. I don't want it to be adversarial. I don't want it to be like, you're going to read my fortune? Well, I bet you can't. And then the psychic's like, well, you have to bring some energy to it, and we're going to read this together. You know what I mean? We want to evoke and reinforce cooperation. We also want to explicitly or subtly learn facts about the customer. So we can explicitly learn facts. We can say, what's been bothering you, or do you live around here? And we can learn facts explicitly by asking. We can also subtly learn facts. A lot of times people think that psychics have hidden cameras in their waiting room, or have some Sherlock-like ability to see like the length of their suit or something like that, or the length of their hair. It's like if a psychic looked at my hair, they'd be like, oh, have you been quarantining for 4 months? It's like, oh yes, I have. So then there's the reading itself. We want to, in the reading, the psychic wants to ascribe control to some distant or magical source. And that is through the vague, whatever the stimuli is in the reading. So the crystal ball is the source, and that's telling me something about the beyond, or your palm is telling me something that's about your life in a mystical way. And I want to make statements about your past, present, future, ancestors, whatever the reason is that you're coming to the reading, in a way that's reinforcing to you, because you're the customer. So we've got this multiple control dynamic already laid out, right? We've got the present customer, present environment, including the customer. We've got some scripts and stock phrases that reduce the labor of invention. I've got lots of things that I often say in the psychic reading, so those reduce the labor. And I've got these vague stimuli. Those combine into psychic responses. And there's a very large operant here, and we're going to dig a little deeper into that. Some psychic response. So let's look at one tool of a psychic, my favorite psychic tool, and that's tarot cards. So tarot cards, if you've never seen them, I've got a deck here, but I'm going to show you some. But I just thought, yes, I do own a set of tarot cards. It's a set of 78 cards, and there are lots of different sets, but they all have painted images on them. They have 22 cards that are like major arcana cards, and I'll show you some of those. And then they also have 4 suits of 14 cards each, 1 through 10, and then page, knight, queen, king. So you've got almost a set of playing cards or poker cards, and then also these major arcana cards. The suits are a little different, but I mean, the specifics aren't very important. We're going to look at the verbal behavior of it. Let's look at one card. Here's a card. Here's another card. There's 3 cards, right? This is one set. This is a set that I have and I like. And the cards themselves have names. The major arcana cards have names. The suits just have a number in the suit. And they have these amazing hand-painted pictures on them. And the pictures they're complicated pictures. Most of them have a figure in them. But this is the Hanged Man, the Magician, and the Chariot. So they have what's on the card themselves, and they also have all this established and inconsistent lore around what they mean. So I've got one book of tarot cards, Power Tarot, by Trish McGregor and Phyllis Vega, which is cool, interesting, I guess. So there's the cards themselves. Let's take a closer look. When we look at this card, and this is the 7 of Swords, we have all sorts of tacts and intraverbals that can be evoked by these cards. In fact, this card is not unlike that picture projective test, is it not? It's a vague picture of a person doing something, and we can look at him and see, well, what is he doing? How is he dressed? Where is he going? Where has he been? You know, it's like, well, he's got these swords. He left some behind. He's moving this way, but he's looking over his shoulder, and it looks like there's a circus or something. And what's that in the future in the background? Is this some sort of battle? There's a dust cloud or something like that. All these things, all these bits of the card can evoke lots of tacts, and those tacts can subsequently, when you make a tact, you can then respond to it as a listener, and that can evoke all sorts of intraverbals. So when we think about even just one card, how much verbal behavior is evoked by the card. And then not only do you have the actual physical stimulus, just the visual stimulus, the suit and the number also have these established, elaborate meanings. So you've got the figure, the orientation, the position, the facial expression, the eyes. His eyes are closed. Did you even notice that? I did. And the background, you can infer meaning in the background as well. So that's just in one card. All sorts of verbal behavior is evoked. Also in tarot cards, you have what's called the spread, or how you lay the cards out, the number of cards that you use and the position of those cards. The card locations in the spread have their own names and meanings and interaction effects with other spots in the spread. And there's a huge number of them. This book has 100 different spreads. This is the Celtic Cross. It's a 10-card spread over there. That's one of my favorites. But there's hundreds of layouts for lots of different purposes. You know, there's like a future spread, or like you're pregnant. Do you want to do this child spread and see what your child's life is going to be like? You know, so there's different spreads for different purposes, right? And there's lots of them. Oh, these are all from dailytarotgirl.com. So just to give you some, give her some credit, I guess, for these pictures. So the card features, the features of the card, the position features, the intraverbals evoked from the card and the position, along with our scripted statements all control some psychic statement, right? And that's a huge operand. That can evoke lots of different things. Now, these are lots of different things that are some psychic statement. I could say something like your job is changing, your relationship will last, be cautious about investing, you're being overlooked, reflect on your skills and how you could use them differently, right? So, but as you see from these things here on the left, I could do this in my home. And very rarely do people like, well, buy my DVD of tarot card readings. It's like, no one wants that. You're supposed to be reading me, right? So we also need convergent intraverbal control from previous statements from your customer. When you've been asking them things, some of those things should evoke intraverbals. So if they've been talking about money, then maybe that evokes be cautious about investing and you're being overlooked at your job, right? So, and then what about subtle tact control of different aspects of the customer? Maybe tacts of the customer evoke that you're being overlooked because they've got kind of a slump, they got kind of a depressed kind of posture about them, and maybe they did something very deftly and you were like, oh, you're pretty skilled. So maybe those things are evoked from the customer themselves, and these things are evoked from the statements that the customer has made, and all these things are evoked by all my psychic stuff. So what do I say? I say you're being overlooked. It's combined. All those things have converged on that one psychic statement. And I'll be danged if that doesn't make the customer say, oh my gosh, you're right. I'm totally being overlooked. That's happened like 3 times now that I've contributed all this and my boss doesn't care and da-da-da-da-da, right? So why is that? What about the customer? Are they just stupid or are they just like gullible? Well, I mean, there's a sucker born every minute, as someone once said, but something is happening in a psychic reading that is worth $2.1 billion a year in the United States, and that is well, this is pre or present condition, but that's the kind of money that's made in psychic reading. So people can be taken advantage of in lots of ways, but the fact is that a psychic reading has value to the listener. Well, what is that value? I think, and I think Skinner would agree with me, that wit, humor, puzzles, and psychic readings are reinforcing because of saltations in response strength. Taking a latent response that exists at some strength and bringing it up into an emitted response has in itself reinforcing properties. Skinner says in Verbal Behavior, some of the best examples of multiple sources of strength are puns and other forms of wit. The effect upon the listener or reader may be amusing or delightful. And in this section, he talks about like a crossword puzzle is like adding little bits of additive stimulus control. So you're like, aha, I've got it, And that's why people do these things every day. They do them because it's reinforcing to experience that moment of the saltation of response strength. So weakly controlled verbal behavior in your own life. So something that is latent about yourself that you have not admitted suddenly combines with the verbal response products from the psychic. And it's true that the psychic is going to say 10 things and you're going to pick up on 4 of them. You know what I mean? But the one that combines with something you are weakly saying about yourself is very reinforcing to have that be said and to hear it and to say, oh my gosh, you're right. So when those sources of strength combine, that is reinforcing. And it could be insightful. That's the thing too. If something already exists at if you have been overlooked at work and you have not tacted that about your life, and then a psychic says a bunch of stuff, one of them being you're overlooked at work, well, if that's the thing you pick up on, then that actually might be insightful about your life. But that's not because of psychic powers. That's because of weakly controlled multiple verbal behavior. Okay? That's kind of what I'm trying to get to. Is that there's no magic in it, but that does not mean that it's worthless, and that it could actually be very interesting and informative. So, across all of these things I've been talking about, what I want you to take away from this is that the world and your repertoire are shockingly and overwhelmingly complex. And the more that we understand about verbal behavior, the more that we understand about ourselves, each other, and how to solve the problems of our world. Because the problems of our world are behavioral problems. So we need to deeply understand them. We can analyze any instance of human activity with our powerful behavior analytic lens. So my other closing point here for you that I hope you'll take with you is not to go to mentalism, free will, mentalistic things that are happening in behavior analysis where we start making up new things. We can stick to our Skinnerian lens and understand a lot of very complicated behavior. So thank you for your attention. I hope this has been enjoyable and informative for you. I have been Tom Ratkos, and I hope to talk to you again sometime.